So instead of Chris Gillis, we have Richard Campbell.
Thanks very much. We got the. Yeah. So yeah, just I work for an organisation called the Nature Conservancy. Chris Gillies was due to come and give this talk, but he sends his apologies, and in his place he sends myself and Theo Kearing here. We're both from WA. Theo's been from the area south of Perth. So we're just going to talk a little bit today about, there's one program in the oceans has been conducting, the TNC has been conducting in the oceans program, and it specifically focuses on restoration of shellfish reef communities. And so when we're talking about shellfish reef communities, we're talking about reef building bivalves, mostly rock oysters, and to a lesser extent mussel communities. And so I guess the reason for why there was this focus on this community was that there wasn't really sort of much known about it. And back in 2014, the people at TNC decided to, I guess, run a kind of parallel process which had happened in the United States. There'd been a well-developed decline in shellfish reefs in the United States, particularly on the East Coast, and the loss of that ecosystem function which came with those really extensive communities. And so within Australia, TNC decided to have a look at what was the case really for developing a kind of shellfish reef restoration as a conservation action for oceans here in Australia. I guess the reason for why that was being undertaken was there was really not much known actually about what was the what had been the historical extent of shellfish reefs in Australia. And for a lot of us, I guess, who'd worked in marine biology, and myself included, it didn't really know much about it and didn't think much of it either as an ecosystem sort of function and as a broad ecotype. And so at that point in starting the program, there was really sort of very little known. But I guess what was known was that shellfish reefs can provide a sort of multitude of benefits. There is an ecosystem function because of their placement around urban centres or their historical extent around urban centres. They have a social function in terms of places for people to go and fish. And if we look a bit further in, we can see that there's extensive kind of cultural connections with First Australians as well. And there had also been this degree of research and effort in the USA over 20 plus years to establish that this might be possible here in Australia. So what did TNC do? So they said, okay, we're going to design this reef recovery program. We've got these 5 sort of areas that we're going to focus on. And we'll use this as our report card at the end of the talk just to say, well, this is how far we've come, I suppose, in the development of this program and its implementation. So I guess at first it was really just get some baseline knowledge. We didn't know really much about it, how much had there been, how much had actually been lost. Could we go through the process of identifying what's left and look at protection mechanisms through legislative means, and also try to bring together a kind of research community to get some site-specific information in terms of the science behind it if we're going to look at trying to do some restoration and conservation management, whilst leaning upon the body of knowledge in America. And I guess to that end, then try to apply that into some sort of new policy and raise some investment dollars to look at what would be possible within a restoration sphere. And so a target was set at the time of being able to rebuild 30% of what was the historical reef extent. I think even though at that point nobody really knew what the extent was. So I guess it was just a rudimentary figure, just a target to work towards. So I guess we've heard a little bit about this from some other talks. There was the development of this network just to try and bring together all the relevant sort of research interests and try to develop that community of knowledge and the sharing of knowledge. And so this only started probably, 6 to 7 years ago. There's now something like 200 plus members, as you can see there. Just 2 weeks ago, they had their biannual conference in Port Stephens in New South Wales. But the network sort of continues in some ways in smaller regional, more informal groups, which discuss sort of relevant issues, which keep things, I guess, live in terms of the development of the knowledge. And as we said, it's very broad. It's not just an academic research community. It includes a lot of aquaculture practice and ranchers, people who've got, 20 to 30 years of experience in the field and who have provided really sort of valuable information. And then this is just a sort of snapshot of what what's been achieved in that time frame of putting together the research community. There have been a lot of papers just in terms of understanding what the extent of ecosystems and oyster beds were throughout Australia. Some priorities and recommendations about engagement with traditional owners and community development, trying to draw down and derive as much sort of social, community and cultural benefit, as well as this ecosystem benefit that we talk about from restoration of communities. So I guess the body of research was there to prove that indeed there had been quite considerable sort of losses established in Australia, which reflected kind of what had happened in the rest of the world. So I guess not much of a surprise that you see in the developed world, there had been extensive use as a food resource, and then there was basically the use of the shell in the construction industry in the early days, the lime burning, that kind of thing. So these communities were harvested pretty heavily in a lot of those areas in the developed world there. So, you know, what they established pretty much that there was something like 99% of native flat oyster reefs lost in Australia. So we're talking about functionally extinct in that regard. In comparison to something like 85% lost in been researched. We were able to, by that process, identify those existing communities and, you know, based on that extent of loss, qualification for critically endangered category through IUCN. Globally, and then also there is currently a proposal to have native flat oyster communities assessed as critically endangered under EPBC Act, and that assessment is coming out soon. So I guess that speaks to some of those goals that were originally set up in terms of the program. But I guess the other aspects that we were interested to and important to consider and note is that shellfish reef communities, as extensive as they were throughout Australia, they were obviously an incredibly important kind of mainstay as a food item for coastal First Australians, Indigenous groups. They were extensively used, they were traded, they were virtually farmed. So there was a lot of, I guess, investment in culture in these habitats. And rapid overharvesting meant that, you know, by the early 1900s, functionally these systems, ecosystems had become extinct. But there was a massive cultural loss and resource loss. Obviously not just that, with colonisation there was loss of a huge amount of other cultural values. But it's just important to remember that there is, I guess, a huge body of knowledge around in traditional ecology about this, and also an extensive sort of feeling of cultural loss about that. So I guess those findings were put together to develop, as we've talked about today, about a guideline about restoration practices in collaboration with SER. TNC has been active in, I guess, a number of areas that we've talked about, and there are a lot of similarities in terms of the production of these guides. They provide some fundamental principles about doing restoration, whether it be for kelp forests, for mangroves, for shellfish reefs. But certainly we were able to tailor this with some of the local knowledge and information that we got. And so then I guess we had to put it into practice. And so extensively, we have 6 main steps to shellfish restoration. And I guess we'll go through and give some examples that we're talking about here. And so we try to use a kind of a science-based process, and understanding also that there is a kind of permitting and an approvals process that's required in terms of selecting the site. We go through in terms of the goals of what we're trying to establish by developing this reef. Again, I just spoke to that notion of we need planning permits and design principles have to be engaged and developed in this. And then we look at developing these in a kind of 2-phase way. We put them in as a pilot trial based on our best knowledge of where they'll be, you know, most suited. But then we field trial it. And then we go to what is a full-scale construction. And I guess that's what we're talking about here, is about scalability of these ecosystem kind of restoration and intervention processes. And so obviously we want to monitor and evaluate not just the pilot scale, but also the full reef construction program, just to see longer term what are the sort of benefits that we're going to derive from that, and how does that play out. And I guess that's something that we're kind of interested in. And of course then, you know, we put all those together, we get our ecosystem services return on investment. And noting that these, you know, these are considerable financial investments that we're talking about. So if we just sort of lay, these are, I guess, in terms of the ways we put together the mapping, and it might be a little bit messy, but so this is an area in the south of south of WA, Oyster Harbour in Albany. And it's just really an overlay of what we have as existing resource users, Aboriginal heritage and other cultural heritage areas, some permits and constraints on fishing activity and access, other environmental values like seagrass distribution, bathymetry because there are some biological requirements. And then we have some water sampling information that comes out. So there's a whole body of information that goes into then producing what we call our sort of heat map of site suitability. And then we go through the permitting process where there may be some degree of compromise in terms of which area we get. But we've got a gradation of areas which we know that we can use as suitable. And then I guess we get into the reef construction. And so it's a large scale sort of industry-based program. There are lots of concomitant benefits, I guess, in terms of that construction. There are a lot of jobs. There's lots of money flowing through to communities. And I guess this comes out in the more recent Reef Builder grant, which I'll get to quickly. So I guess as an example, here is one of the reefs built off in St Vincent's Gulf in South Australia. And this was an area, this is what probably the largest reef construction area in Australia, up to 20 hectares of sort of interrelated reef communities. You can see the individual reef communities from these areas here, and they're the bathymetric lines. And so this is a series of sort of interconnected reefs and upwards of 20 hectares and somewhere near 6 million oysters, knowing that one individual oyster can filter up to, you know, a couple of 100 litres of water a day. So we're talking about quite a large sort of filtering capacity, let alone then the added biodiversity that comes with the development of the reef, with the fish life, encrusting invertebrates, etc. And I guess this is what some of those kind of communities look like. Some of these are intertidal, some of them are subtidal. A lot of these have not been in the water for a long time, so the monitoring over time will show us what are these kind of biodiversity gains and what's the development of those ecosystems as we sort of move on. And we have some mussel communities on the left there and some Angazi native flat oysters on the right. So I'm just quickly going to drill down into an area where, this is where Theo comes from, traditional owner of the Binjarab area. This is the Peel Harvey estuary in Mandurah, just south of Perth. And as presented, I guess a bit of a special case because it's not a natural oceanic embayment. It's an estuarine habitat with extensive residential and agricultural use in all the catchments, a long history of poor water quality in the last 50 years, a lot of management plans which haven't been able to address, I guess, and redress the concerns about water quality and loss of fish life, eutrophication processes. And it's also an area that Binjarab had traditional custodianship of. And waterways conservation is an area that people are very keen to want to get back in, having been sort of locked out when you're not the landholder anymore. And so the Binjarab have been developing these, I guess, Aboriginal-led programs where they want to be involved in designing frameworks for monitoring the assessment of the condition of the resource so that it reflects cultural considerations as well as the environmental and the fact that people still want to go and be able to collect food from these areas. And so TNC are looking to move into, I guess, some of this area and broaden the expanse of what the benefits of that program will be for the reef restoration in the Peel Harvey estuary. So we're looking to help stand up and get involved with the Ranger program, which has just started. Theo's lucky enough to have 2 jobs. He's also the Ranger coordinator for the recently started Binjarab Ranger group. So he is taking some well-earned rest and break from that at the moment. But what we're trying to do is develop what these benefits will be in a broader social context as well. And so that's part of the program that we're looking to continue to develop as well as this reef restoration program. I guess I'm running out of time so quickly. So now talking about scalability in terms of sites, we're currently working in something like 15 areas, but we're looking to expand that to about 60 sites, which equates to what was determined as that 30% of historical localities. And as you can see, they're pretty much dotted all the way around the sort of southwest and southeastern coasts, but notable emissions throughout the whole of the north of Australia at present. And so recently funded through the Australian government, the TNC have received $20 million as part of a kind of stimulus, a COVID relief and recovery fund, because of some of these extra sort of social benefits that come through the construction of the reefs. It's going to provide employment, it provides opportunities for recreational fishing. We're going to try and develop as much sort of social and cultural benefits that come out of it. We've got targets in terms of the degree of spend that the money goes into the community. And, you know, we hope to sort of develop that and achieve that as we go. And I guess just quickly, in the orange here on the left is what is understood now as the previous extent of shellfish reef. And as you can see, it's massive. You know, if you put it against, I guess, what is Australia's icon of the Great Barrier Reef. And so I guess even for me, you know, working in the marine sector, this was a bit of a shock at the extent of what the shellfish reef communities probably were in Australia. And so I guess just quickly, well, we've been able to determine to some extent, you know, what the loss was. So, you know, we know there's less than 10% left now. There are steps being made to try to get protection and assessment under EPBC as well as IUCN for what we've got there. There's been quite an output with regards to academic sort of discoveries and production of papers and ongoing research community in postgrad and postdoc. And also, I guess, they've been quite successful in garnering funding. And that's sort of ongoing, I guess. Once this Reef Builder program rolls out, there may be more opportunities. And at the moment, we're not quite a quarter of, or maybe just a quarter of a way through getting to that 30%. So I'll just quickly wrap up and say thank you to all the people that helped present this, produce this paper. No time for questions.
Thank you so much. We'll just take some questions now. You've just got to hold it on the button.
So my question. Quite quickly because he was being modest, but he's definitely been a big draw card in making sure that the engagement program with the Noongar community down there has been first class. Everybody is on board from the community, both all through the Binjar area, which is not only just Mandurah, because the Peel Inlet is based in Mandurah. But we've also got Harvey on board, Pinjar, Dwelling Up, and the Serpentine. So the Serpentine River runs through Mandurah and north. The Murray River runs throughout to Pinjar and up past Dwelling Up, and the Harvey runs back into Harvey. So all their areas have definitely been included, and it's awesome from our point of view to be a part of that. The second part to your question, Richard also has been a big part in helping us with development of the Ranger program in the area, and the Ranger program will hopefully be a big part in taking over some of the things that TNC is setting up.
Yeah, and I think the development of that water story, that was an Aboriginal-led program, and that talks about broad waterways conservation, cultural consideration, as well as physical community restoration. And yeah, I probably didn't, you know, do it justice trying to put too much in, but they, yeah, sure, yeah, and yeah, and I think it's a really important part of what can be achieved with the programs, you know. Yeah. And school groups as well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot that sort of sits behind it, I guess, but yeah, I think.
All right. Well, thank you guys for filling in for Chris, and that was amazing. And we're going to have to move on to the next talk now, so you're going to take that off.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you.